Working?
Yep, looks good from here. You're good to go.
All right. So brewing raw beer. So this is going to be, as I mentioned earlier, mostly about some chemistry of raw beer. I'm not going to really do too much on like history or recipes or that kind of thing. If you're interested in the history, the Lars blog is a fantastic resource, or Farmhouse Brewing Techniques by Lars Marius Garschel. Um, I got into brewing raw beer because it was easy and convenient, not for the historical aspect. So that's more what I focus on. So there's no real definition for raw beer. There's no like BJCP specification for raw beer. So you'll find some different definitions depending on who you talk to. These are sort of the five that I think sort of categories that you could lump what most people consider raw beer into. Personally, the first two I don't consider raw beer. Because I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere. And for me, that line's at 100 Celsius. So if you're hitting a boil, I don't think of it as raw. I consider anything where it's just never at a boil at any point raw. But opinions can vary. So those three categories, so the first one is just like pasteurizing at a below boiling temperature. So basically the same as a normal brew day. Only instead of heating all the way up to 100 Celsius, you stop somewhere in between, wait for a while, and then chill. You can also skip that and just lauter and then chill immediately. And you can also directly ferment your mash. This is something that actually I was completely unaware that anybody did for beer brewing until Lars blog posted something about this being actually relatively common in rural Russia. Personally, I don't see any real reason for anybody to do this currently for a lot of their beer brewing, unless you want to do a historical thing, just because it seems like it'd be a big mess to me. I don't want to clean grain out of my carboys. And also, I mean, separating out the post-ferment beer from the grain seems like a real pain. But if you're distilling, there's actually a lot of research on this for increasing your extract efficiency. So if you ferment your mash and have a mash filter or something along the lines of a mash filter, you can get a little bit more hand sanitizer, because of course that's what everybody's distilling, right? So I'm going to mostly be talking about subboil pasteurization because I think this is the most versatile method. The unpasteurized stuff is basically the same thing, except for you just have a slightly higher risk of infection. And the fermented mash, like I said, to me that seems like a lot of work for not a lot of benefit. So pasteurization without boiling. So this is something that you can go really in depth into. Like there are whole textbooks written about this. And something that's sort of important to keep in mind on this is that this is in fact pasteurization, not sterilization. And we mix these two terms up quite a lot in home brewing. There's a big difference between them. So they're both to a certain degree a statistical process. Like you're never necessarily, unless you go to very extreme lengths, going to guarantee that there's nothing alive left in something. But sterilization, that's what you're trying to do. You're basically trying to kill every single living thing, as well as spores, which are actually remarkably hard to kill. So there are spores that can survive like hours in boiling solution. So you're not sterilizing your beer most likely ever, and you're definitely not sterilizing your chiller when you put it into your boiling wort for 10 minutes. So our standard, so we probably, as brewers, when we think of sterilizing, we're actually not meeting really the specification for sterilizing. So if you look at something for actually sterilizing things, it's usually like 120 Celsius for like 15 to 20 minutes. And obviously we can't do that because our wort's boiling. It won't go over 100 Celsius unless you're making your wort in an instant pot, which if you are, I'd be very curious what that beer tastes like, but I'm not going to do it. So what we're really doing is pasteurizing, and that's really what we're worried about. We want to get the population of living microbes down to such a low level that they'll be outcompeted by our brewing yeast, and then there will be in a low nutrient, low pH, relatively high alcohol from a microbial standpoint environment, so they won't cause us any particular problems. So to actually build these standards, you have to choose like model organisms and model environments. And like I said, it gets really, really complicated. And there's not a lot of research on this specifically for beer because beer is almost always boiled. So people don't really see a point in in funding research into such topics. But if you look into the dairy industry and the juice industry, you find a lot of information about pasteurization, and you can find these lovely charts of different microbes, how long they'll survive at a certain temperature, and just reams and reams of information. So the important thing to remember is as you go up in temperature, it takes less and less time to kill the vast majority of the microbes, and the inverse is also true. So for dairy, they consider 72 Celsius for 15 seconds like their legal pasteurization requirement. And for them, boiling actually, I say almost instantaneous here, but the actual number is 0.01 seconds at 100 Celsius legally qualifies as pasteurized. So for their specifications, you can tell that a typical beer is going way beyond what's necessary to pasteurize. And in fact, for like a longer time pasteurizing, 150 Fahrenheit is actually sufficient for 30 minutes. So your mash, unless you're like mashing at 146 Fahrenheit or something, is technically pasteurized from at least a dairy standpoint. Dairy and beer are obviously not the same thing, but like I said, there's not a huge amount of information on what matters for beer in terms of like academic research. So you kind of have to go with stuff that's sort of close, like dairy and juice. That said, I go significantly beyond their pasteurization requirements because there's not really any reason not to. Like, it's no skin off your back to wait for 10 minutes at 80 Celsius versus 15 seconds at 72 Celsius. I mean, it's 10 minutes of your life. It's not really that big of a deal. And it's not that much hotter. So that's what I do, that ADC for 5 to 10 minutes. I'm also brewing on a robo brew these days. I used to brew on my stove. So it takes a while for it to get up to that temperature. So it's like really pasteurized because it's spending quite a while in that, over like 148, 150 Fahrenheit range where you are killing off a lot of things as time goes along. And as you may notice, that pasteurization rest temperature is pretty much right on a top steep or whirlpool, depending on your terminology, temperature for New England IPAs. So if you want the fastest New England IPA you've ever made in your life, you can just mash, bring it up to that temperature, whirlpool, chill, and ferment. And actually it can come out pretty well. I have a picture of one later in the presentation. So another thing, this is something that we almost never think about brewing, is your enzymes. They can actually be a little bit more resilient than some of the microbes. There is almost no research on this. There's only pretty much sort of research on related enzymes. So like different amylases to the barley amylase, and comments from people who are like familiar in the area. So like Richard Priest has a couple of times talked about enzymes being retained through pasteurization in raw beers, but not that much research on it. So beta amylase is pretty much definitely going to be gone, right? Because it's only stable for a few minutes in the mash anyway. Alpha may or may not be retained. It's hard to say. There's no research really on it. But if it is, you might get a little bit more attenuation than you expect, or a little bit further starch conversion. Limit dextrinase is the more interesting one. So a lot of the research you find on limit dextrinase is done in pure water. And limit dextrinase actually has a huge difference in stability between wort and pure water. So a lot of brewing texts, I think even How to Brew says this, that limit dextrinase will denature in like minutes in the mash, and that is definitely not true. It is much more stable than that in a wort environment. So if that is surviving your pasteurization step, you will lose dextrins. So your beer will be a little bit thinner than you would expect. However, dextrins are not like the primary source of thinness, and there's some later effects that kind of overpower this. But like more of your body is provided by proteins and like beta glucans and that kind of thing than is by dextrins. So it's not really that big of a deal. But if you do get a couple of points lower than you expect on a raw beer, don't be amazed, right? You might just have some enzymes carrying through. So that was all the boring stuff that nobody finds interesting, even really me. This is where it starts to get kind of more controversial and exciting and recipe related. So DMS, So when I first started showing up to meetings with raw beers, the first question out of everybody's mouth was, what about DMS? So DMS is something that it's not really super well explained, I guess, in a lot of brewing texts. So malt doesn't contain DMS, not really. It's commonly stated that continental Pilsner malt has a huge amount of DMS, but it doesn't really. Not even if it's like a malt that's made by some grandfather in Czechia who's like rolling the floor malting with a broomstick or something. There's not going to be much DMS in it. What it does contain is S-methylmethionine and dimethyl sulfoxide. So S-methylmethionine, or SMM, is sort of the main DMS source in your beer. And if anybody's not familiar with DMS, this is that flavor that's sort of like, it's kind of like vegetal, I guess, best way to describe it. It's not the most enjoyable of things. But you get it in some like Czech lagers, which is part of where people get this sort of Pilsner thing idea from. But DMS has to be converted, or sorry, SMM has to be converted into DMS for it to end up in your beer at the end of the day. And that is a temperature dependent reaction. So you have to be pretty hot for this to happen at any kind of like appreciable rate. In fact, you have to be nearly at a boiling temperature. But DMS is very, very volatile. So it will boil at 100 Fahrenheit. So interestingly enough, if you're fermenting like a Vosk Fike up at like the upper end of its temperature range, then you're actually at DMS's boiling temperatures as well. So in those cases, you will definitely never have DMS if you do like raw beer at such temperatures. But anyway, so if your pasteurization step is not near boiling, you're going to be volatilizing most of the DMS because you're not producing it very quickly, and it's still it's not boiling off, but it's evaporating off. So that's not really a problem unless you're doing these very, very high temperature pasteurization rests for a very long time. So DMSO is the other one. This is not something that's really that big of a deal. If you get a DMSO thing, it's a contamination problem, almost certainly. Like this is a conversion that happens via microbial action. It's not something that's like a wort chemistry or mash chemistry kind of thing. So I just included that for completeness. You don't really have to worry about DMSO. It's just the SMM thing. Just keep your raw beers below like 195 Fahrenheit or something. I would actually go a little bit lower. I would stay under like 180-ish, and you won't have a DMS or any such problem. So hopping. So this is sort of the where you can get a little bit of a this becomes a recipe design challenge, I guess, more than like a brewing chemistry thing. So you do need higher temperatures to efficiently isomerize alpha acid. You can get isomerization at lower temperatures, but it's not very efficient. You're not going to get a lot of bitterness. This isn't necessarily always a problem. So of course, New England IPA, you might have no desire for any isomerized alpha acids. So obviously that works really nicely with raw techniques. Some things don't have any significant amount of hops, like Goza, Berliner Weiss, Gruitz, that kind of thing. So again, that works nicely. If you don't require much isomerization, you can sometimes get away with it. Just like isomerization at the lower temperatures. But most of the time, you want a lot of isomerized alpha acids. A lot being, in relative terms, not like 5 IBU. So for that, you need to make a hop tea, or you need to purchase pre-isomerized hop extract. So I've never worked with the pre-isomerized hop extract. In theory, it's a great tool for this. I have no experience with it. But when you're making the hop tea, there's a few sort of hop chemistry points to it. So higher pHs do increase your hop extraction efficiencies, but all of the research on this is done actually primarily by ABI. So they want to use the smallest amount of hops possible to get their like 9 IBU in Miller Lite as possible. So that's all focused around typical sort of wort pHs, and thusly tap water pH is way off the charts. So I can't tell you like a conversion factor of like, if you thought you were going to get 10 IBU in wort, you're now going to get 15 IBU. It doesn't work that way because there's no research, right? But do expect it to be a little bit more bitter than you would expect from that level of hops. You can also get a little bit more of a bitterness, or sorry, a harsher bitterness from higher pHs. I personally don't find this to be that significant of an effect, but if you're sort of sensitive to harsh bitterness and you're getting that off of your hop tea based beers, this is something to keep in mind. Something else that's kind of handy is that you can use this to adjust your bittering levels to taste, but personally, I would be very hesitant to suggest doing that, because I mean, I'm sure all of us have tried our work prior and after fermentation, and everybody knows like those can have wildly different bittering levels, and it does depend a lot on your yeast. Like some yeasts will pull out a lot more bittering compounds than other yeasts, so you have to be a little careful with that, but it is something you can do. Something else you can do is hop decoctions. So this is a really, really old technique. This is actually Berliner Weisse used to be commonly made this way. In fact, Berliner Weisse used to be almost always raw, using a decoction mash, if you consider that raw anyway, because it is hitting boiling, but it's portions of the mash. There's no real way to calculate IBUs for that I'm aware of, because I mean, there's no research on that, and nobody is really hopping their decoction mashes on their IPAs or something where this really matters, but it is a technique you can use. Personally, when I did this, I just like approximated it as a 15-minute boil or something, and it seemed to work out okay. So protein retention, this is a big difference. This is one of those things that you will definitely notice when you're drinking a raw beer. To me, actually, this is the only like dead giveaway of a raw beer. So one, you don't get a hot break, of course. That means you will have more protein in your beer. So you'll have more haze, particularly more chill haze. You can actually get it relatively clear, but you have to do, like you're starting from a disadvantage, right? So you have to be very good about your, ideally your cold crashing hard if you can. Personally, I can't, so I have to give up that one. But, being good about, lautering to a relatively clear wort and all that kind of business. Fining can help a bit. Clarifirm and Clarex can, which are two different names for the same enzyme, they can kind of directly attack this problem by breaking down these proteins. I don't find that they make a huge effect, but they do clear it up a little bit. Personally, I don't think it's worth the cost of the enzyme, but maybe you really like slightly clearer color beers. The mouthfeel is a huge difference though. Like raw beers will have the soft, sort of rich, almost like velvety mouthfeel that is just, it's very different than most like boiled beers. You can kind of get the same thing in a really strong oatmeal stout, I guess. Like it has the same sort of soft richness, but you'll have that in all barley beers. And you can also get from this, this is actually, again, this is one of those parts where I'm taking a step out of the established science. Your fermentation health may be a bit improved. There is some evidence that fan levels are better with shorter boils. There's no research on fan levels in unboiled wort because none of the big guys are doing raw beers. But it does logically follow that given that you want amino acids, and proteins are made of amino acids, more proteins, more amino acids. So this can help with lower gravity Kvike beers in case, if this is in fact a significant effect, which personally I think it is. And the head retention. This is something that doesn't get talked about a lot in raw beers. This is unreal. Like the head retention on some raw beers is just unbelievable to the point where it becomes a bit of a problem. Like it's difficult to pour a pint. So I have a good demonstration of this. As you may see, not only does this have a nice big head on the glass, there is an enormous head in the bottle. And that head was staying in the bottle for quite a while and actually made it difficult to pour more out of the bottle. And every single bottle of this is like that. Of course, this is a Saison, so it's up at like 3.64 volume, something like that. So it's, of course, being pushed up a little bit. But this will happen with pretty much everything that's raw, unless it's like an unhopped sour beer. So limited boil off, this is another one that's it's not really talked about that much as a limitation of the process. Since you can't evaporate that much water because you're not boiling, your gravity at the end of lauter is about as high as it will ever be. this has some sort of bang on effects for higher gravity beers. So given that, you know, you have a fixed volume of water for your batches, besides, you know, grain absorption and such, as you go up and up for a higher gravity beer, you'll have less water that you can sparge with, which then means that you're running, you know, a lower efficiency because you're going to have less water washing grain out of your mash. Thus, you'll need more grain to get to your higher gravity, which will then cut into your water more, and so you can end up, you know, with needing just outrageous quantities of grain. But this depends a little bit on your system and details of other techniques. Some people aren't really affected by thick mashes that much. People like me who are brewing on robo brews, once you hit a certain thickness, like your mash efficiency just goes into the toilet. So I can't do like a raw imperial stout unless I had a bunch of D&E or something like that. But again, that's not always the case. I know a guy who has a really big mash tun who accidentally brewed 15 gallons of 11% raw, basically barley wine, and then got extremely drunk for several months thereafter. So Flavour Effects. This is one that I think depends a lot on who you ask, but the one thing that I would say is very consistent is if you think about like that smell as you're boiling, especially like right when you come up to boil, or the smell of your mash tun, as this quote from Marcello really says it quite well. It smells like my mash tun. So those smells are still remaining in your wort instead of getting boiled off. And you know, that quote from Marcello is about a raw sort of Marzen that some of you may have had actually if you're at last year's Quake meeting. But it's both a, you know, advantage and a disadvantage. I think styles like Berliner Weisse and Goza, this can be very nice because in those you're using like such a tiny amount of grain, but especially Berliner Weisse is a pretty malt forward style. Like all you have is, you know, a little bit of malt and some lactic acid, and that's all of your flavor. So it can be very nice to just like try to eke out every little bit of that doughy malt character that you can get. For styles like that Marzen, it can end up a little heavy-handed and taste like your mash tun. Or like a, you know, a pastry shop without the sugar or something like that. Like that's probably the best description of the flavor, besides the mash tun one. And of course, it's not very noticeable in things like New England IPA because you're putting, you know, a pound of hops in 5 gallons of beer. You're going to taste a pound of hops. You're not going to taste a little bit of extra malt character. So you can make a lot of different things with this sort of process. So this is just 6 different raw beers that I made last year. So on the left, that's an Imperial IPA. Then there's that Marzen. That's a kind of, that one is applying pretty much every trick that I could get to try to clarify a barley-based beer. Sort of like extended like months and months of lagering. So that's about the best like clarity you can expect without extended times, in case you're curious. Next one, that's just a raw Goza, then a New England IPA, Imperial Stout, and then the last one is a kind of a curious beer, because that's actually about as clear as the Marzen, but that beer is actually entirely spelt and wheat. There's no barley in it. So that one, like, that sort of, you can do some funny stuff to get clearer beers with raw beers, but you have to do some really weird grain bills. And so just to get some quick details, you know, overall summary. So reduce electricity and propane usage. I didn't really talk about this too much, but it's kind of implied. You know, not coming up to a boil, not having to boil for an hour requires way less power. And your general equipment requirements are a lot lower. So there's some subtle ones to this that you don't really think about that are actually really nice if you know somebody that wants to get into brewing but doesn't want to get a whole enormous quantity of equipment. So you, of course, don't need a very powerful oven or stove or whatever to heat up your wort because you're not going to a boil. And your kettle can be a lot smaller. So this is one that I think is big, big, big for people who are just getting into brewing. You can do a 5-gallon raw batch with a 5-gallon pot as your kettle. You know, you'd be filled to the brim if you put it all in there, but if you have a hop tea on the side taking up, you know, a couple of liters, then it becomes more comfortable. You know, you're not boiling, so you don't have to worry about boil over. You can fill stuff to the brim. which is pretty nice. So decoupling fermentable wort production from hop additions. This is one for people who perhaps spent too much time reading The New IPA by Scott Janish, because there's a few points in there where he's talking about some things where it's like, well, that would be great, but I can't do that because I have to put my hops in wort. But this lets you do things like play with different levels of pH for extraction of different hops if you wanted. So you can make multiple hop teas because they're now not, don't have to go into the wort. You can do a lot of crazy stuff. Please let me know if you do. I never really experimented too much with that, but it's something that I always wanted to try. So the brew day being much faster is probably the biggest advantage. It's hard to describe how relaxing raw beer brew days can be, because it's just like you just mash in, go do something for an hour, sparge, just like, especially if you're running like a rim system, you just punch it up to your, pasteurization rest temperature, clean up your grain. Probably by the time you're done throwing out your grain, you can just start the chiller. Probably want to recirculate a bit to, clean out the chiller, of course, and make sure you don't infect stuff with your chiller, but it's just so fast and easy. And those pitching, the cooling is also extremely fast, especially if you're brewing at home, like in your kitchen. Sorry, you're all brewing at home. But, cooling in the kitchen sink, for instance, like a lot of people do when they're starting out. I did that when I was starting out. Slow as hell. So it's a lot faster if you're cooling from 165 to 175 down to, say, 100 if you're pitching Voss Kvike, than it is to cool from 212 down to, 68 or 50 or something like that. And you get a little bit more of that first running small character, which can be quite handy. On the downside, it doesn't really work too well for high gravity beers, depending on your equipment. Your clarity is not going to be super great. And that soft, rich mouthfeel is probably not the best if you want to be making Pilsner, for instance, because you want that crispiness. Although there's some dude on Homebrew Talk who's apparently the laziest German in the world, self-described, who's making raw Pilsner, I think. It might be raw Helles, and has been doing it for years, so maybe some disagree. The brewing software thing, this is actually a big problem, depending on what you're doing. I found this extremely frustrating in Beersmith. Brewfather's not quite as bad, but for like raw NEPAs, you can usually get it to work okay. But if you're doing stuff with hop teas, the IBU calculation is just a complete crapshoot. And you pretty much have to work it out on your own, doing something else and guess and check. Of course, that malt character, again, that can be an advantage or disadvantage. Answering the same question about DMS gets pretty boring. That's why I can actually say S-methylmethionine without, stumbling over myself, because I've said that a lot. And it's boring. And also, of course, you'll have Gordon Ramsay angry at you. So, questions?
So with raw brewing, is there any differences with your sanitation just because you're not bringing your wort up to this or your mash up to the same temperature?
What do you mean?
Well, because if you're holding something at a boil for a long time, the chances are you're going to be killing off a lot of the, I guess, bad stuff that you wouldn't want to get in that could contaminate your wort. And with the raw brewing, because you're not holding it up there for so long, is there any chance that you could potentially inadvertently contaminate your beer?
It's technically possible. Like it is. So like a good way to think of sort of pasteurization is like if you think of it as pasteurization units is one way I've heard it described. So if you think about it like a pasteurization unit as a certain amount of stuff being killed, which would be like a certain time at a certain temperature. Like this isn't a real unit, right? This is just a way of thinking about it. So you're getting a lot more pasteurization units when you're boiling for 60 minutes, right? So your odds of something surviving are significantly lower, but you're probably overdoing it. So you don't actually, you need to kill off most things. Like beer is inherently relatively safe. It's a little bit of a different story if you're worried about, like, if you're a commercial brewery or something and you're worried about stuff going to distribution where it's going to be stored warm and what, like, I would be kind of hesitant to do a lot of raw beer if I was, doing heavy distribution across the country or something like that. But yeah, technically speaking, it's not as sterile as a boiled beer, but I've never had any kind of contamination issue with raw beers. And, I would wager that probably you're more likely to have a contamination issue from like your ball valve than using a raw process. But yeah, technically speaking, the answer is yes. It is more likely to be contaminated, but I would say it probably doesn't really matter that much as long as the rest of your sanitation's on point.
Okay, cool.
You said Beersmith doesn't handle no boil very well. Like, what happens if you put the boil time to 0? Does it not like zero out the additions of boil?
So it's been a long time since I used Beersmith. I got fed up with it corrupting its database and deleting all of my recipes. So I like reaching back. The last time I used it was over a year ago, but from what I recall, so you can zero out the boil, and that does correct for the water losses and that kind of thing. So your volume should match, but I think it was like I think something with like the water chemistry was screwy or something, but I don't know. I had a lot of problems with Beersmith, to be honest. Partially because like it constantly would have stuff in imperial, and I was working in liters, and then I would always just be like, I'm not sure if this label is just not adjusted for liters, and it's saying gallons when it means liters or kilograms, and just it was super frustrating. Whereas Brewfather, I find, is just a lot more clear about what's going on. So even if they had the same capabilities, in Brewfather, I have a lot more confidence that when I say 0-minute boil, it knows what I'm doing.
Yeah, Brewfather works great for me. I posted in the discussion group though that Brewfather works great for the recipe, but when you try the new experimental automation, it'll actually set the temperature to 98 degrees Celsius during the sparge phase for your grain father, because it can control the grain father now, right? So if you're trying to do no boil, I'm trying to pasteurize at 75 degrees Celsius, so I have to quickly set that back. But if I were to step away, then yeah, I would get it up to a near boil, which is no bueno if I'm trying to produce some DMS there.
Have you filed a bug with
I mentioned it, yeah, to the developer directly. I didn't file a bug specifically, but I messaged him on, he's in another brewing group that I'm in. A question for you, Luke. How do you do your hop tea process personally?
So for me, I just take off like a portion of the water that I would be treated to remove the chloramines and all that kind of business. And I just boil it in the side in a smaller pot and add the hops as if like I follow a hopping schedule, pretty much like I was doing a normal beer. Trying to generally aim for the like lower range of bitterness for the style I'm after, because you do get a little bit more extraction, which is another thing you have to be careful with. Besides just that pH extraction thing, there is a effect on like hop extraction from the gravity of the wort. And when you're doing a hop tea, you're extracting to like 1.000, right? There's no sugar in it. And usually in Beersmith or Brewfather, if you put something in as a boil addition, it's going to assume that it's a boil addition at the pre-boil gravity. So it will miscalculate the IBUs pretty badly. Like they'll be compounding things, so you'll suddenly end up with like really bitter beer.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you also do a sparge in your raw ales?
Yes.
Okay, I do as well. My idea was basically to take like a French press and like put like boiling water into it and treat with chlorine, or for chlorine first, do a French press and just kind of keep jumping that up for taste and see if I can get some kind of right balance of IBUs. But that makes a lot more sense, taking it from the already treated water and then boiling it inside.
That would work too. I keep trying to convince somebody actually to try making a hop tea in an instant pot, because I'm curious what would happen in the closed environment with a above boiling temperature. But like there's no wrong way, right? Like you're outside of the bounds of like brewing dogma when you're doing raw beers, and Like there's no, text, there's no like how to brew raw beers out there that's just gonna like force you to do a certain way.
Yeah, I think like the French press would be interesting. I didn't know how much exactly to treat the water, if it's a small amount for a chlorine with like a Camden tablet. So I was kind of like continuing to experiment with that. The main thing I want to add though is that like Pilsner malt, raw, has an amazing grain flavor to it. Just Pilsner by itself, like it just has like this unique element to it. I think that alone makes a raw ale the first time you have one so interesting. Like Marcello's comment there that this is like a mash tun. You really get that mash elements. Like you're almost tasting what you walk into an apartment full of like a mash going on. You get that flavor into your mouth. Specifically from Pilsner, I noticed it the most. And it adds a different dynamic, whereas like most Pilsner malts, so like Environment Pilsner, I get like kind of like apples or some kind of like soft bread. But with this, like it's a grainy element. It's just so deep. I recommend that everybody tries it, like 100% Pilsner raw ale for their first one.
It's really like a very rich malt character. I'm totally with you on that.
I see there's a question in the chat. Are you able to see it?
Let's see.
Justin Moore asks, how quickly should you plan to drink an entire batch of raw beer before it loses either character or goes bad?
Yeah, so that's a topic of some debate. Like, obviously, some people even in the club have had it go, a little bit, lose some flavor or whatever. Personally, I've had raw beers that have gotten pretty old. Like, not like, I have some like Brett Saisons that have gotten up to a year now, but that's Brett. That changed the game on aging completely. The oldest I've gone to is like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months or something, and it still tasted fine to me. Lars Garshol is in the it doesn't affect aging camp, but a lot of people do find it reduces their shelf life. So I think this is one of those ones where you kind of have to try it for yourself, because it could be something that like maybe there's a flavor compound degrading that I just am not sensitive to, and the Lars isn't sensitive to, but then somebody else is very sensitive to. Like I don't know. There's not really any like scientific research to this that you can point to and be like, oh yes, because you're not degrading, or because you're not hot breaking out all of the proteins, you're going to get this compound over time as it reacts with this other compound. Like there's just not that level of knowledge on the process.
My last Gosa was raw, and it held up quite well. Now, granted, that's a sour beer, so.
But that must be one of the traditional processes for Goza too, right? Because you mentioned Berliner. It was one of the traditional processes. So
Berliner and Goza are pretty, they're kind of separate in a lot of that kind of stuff, I think. Like, that history, like Goza's died out and been recreated like 3 times over the last 300 years.
I have the book on the history of Goza, and I couldn't find any reference to it being a raw beer at one time, but they don't know a lot about it when you go a certain length back, because as Luke said, it's been recreated and reimagined like several times throughout the years. So I don't think anybody really knows what the original ones were like. You know, they were spontaneously fermented, but I don't think they really know much else.
Is Berliner with the one with like the gooseneck thing, or is that Goza?
Are you talking about the thing where like the bottle would get plugged by?
Yeah, that one. I thought that
I think that's Goza, but I might be wrong.
That's-
Guillaume in the chat just said Goza.
That's Goza for sure.
Okay, that's Goza. All right. I had a question. So in one of your slides, you showed a picture of all your beers, and then you said, like the second one was your Marts, and that's the one where you pulled out all the stops and did all the tricks. I was wondering what all the tricks are for that one.
So the tricks on that one, that's not quite as many tricks, I guess, as that makes it sound. So that's Clarity Firm and Biofine Clear, just to like, find the, and of course, like, so one other thing that I didn't mention that is, in theory, Whirl Flock should not be quite as effective in raw beers. But that depends a lot on the hydration characteristics of carrageenan, which is like the active ingredient in Whirl Flock. So with a lot of raw pasteurization steps, you're kind of sitting at around the necessary like temperature and time to activate carrageenan. So it might do something of use. So whether or not that one actually made a big difference, I can't really say. But so that was Royal Flock in the pasteurization step. I think I actually added it to the hop tea and then added the hop tea to the, like the hop tea while it was hot to the wort in the hopes that that would, you know, help distribute it a little bit more. Then Clarity firmed it in the fermenter, and Biofine cleared it in the keg. And I lagered it for, I think, like 3 weeks or something. So not like a particularly long lagering period, but, you know, longer than, you know, a day or two. But I have actually had clearer raw beers than that, but they were ones that were, actually there was specifically one beer that I completely forgot about and was behind my couch for like 4 months, and I pulled it out and it was like crystal clear. But realistically speaking, you don't want to like be brewing a, you know, raw beer, be like, I'm going to drink this in 4 months as like a requirement to get it raw. So I don't think that was really a very useful data point.
Luke, have you done any mixed culture sour beers raw? And if so, like, did you notice a difference due to it being raw or not, because the bread and the bacteria would just like chew through all the extra protein over time anyway?
So I have done Brett mixed fermentation beers, and I have done lacto mixed fermentation beers, mixed fermentation raw beers, but I have not done Brett and lacto mixed fermentation raw beers.
Okay.
So actually the head retention thing on the sour beers is kind of nice, because that can be a little bit of a struggle. So like that Goza, like that one, right? Like that's several minutes after pouring, and it's still just like completely full of foam, which is nice when, you know, Gozas sometimes drop their foam pretty fast. Like you can ameliorate that effect a little bit with pre-acidification and stuff, but it's nice to have that little trick in your back pocket to get a little bit of extra head on it. Flavor-wise, I didn't notice a big difference from it. The Brett stuff, I've actually only done one. Actually, sorry, I've done 2 raw Brett beers, but one of them got a little bit of too much oxygen in it and ended up getting massive amounts of ethyl acetate, and I ended up dumping it because it was disgusting. The other one, I don't know, it tasted a little bit weird, but that one also had some buckwheat honey in it. As I was screwing around with biotransformation of caprylic acid. I think it's caprylic, might be caprylic acid or something like that. So buckwheat honey is famous in mead brewing for making stuff taste terrible. And it's because buckwheat contains this caprylic acid, which tastes like a goat. But Brett can transform that into like pineapple flavors. So those are the only 2 sort of breaded things I've done, and they both are probably not very representative for other reasons.
Okay. I've done a couple mixed culture sour beers raw now, but one of them is still fermenting. And the other one, I put in way too many grape skins, so it's just super grapey. So I haven't really been able to comment yet on if it made a difference, but I'm interested to see in the one that's fermenting, because I didn't fruit that one or anything. And I did that because I noticed some of Half Hours on Earth beers are raw, and they taste great, so I just wanted to try it too. I figure if anything else, the extra protein will just be more food for the bugs over time, so might get some more Brett phenols or something. So hopefully.
Yeah.
We'll see.
It's the Wild West. You do what you want. I mean, yeah, the thing on the Brett stuff with raw beers for me is just like Brett's such a time commitment that I tend to like make my Brett beers or like pretty long brew days, or like it's a very specific thing I'm going for. I'm not specifically trying to like fiddle around with raw beers. It's like try some specific thing like biotransforming, you know, goat flavors from honey or something like that. Although I do wish I had thrown Brett into the like raw Berliner Weisse I brewed at the beginning of this year, intending to like enter it into competitions, and then, you know, all the competitions were canceled. So I was like, could have thrown Brett in this, and I could have had, this nice Berliner Weisse that could have aged over years and been delicious. And instead, I've got cases of Berliner Weisse just sitting on my closet.
Anyone else have any questions for Luke? If not, why don't we call the presentation and we can keep talking. But thank you very much, Luke, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm definitely inspired to give this a shot, especially you and Mark talking about the Pilsner malt and tasting like what a mash tun smells like after you mash in. And I'm glad you said that, because earlier when you said it smells like my mash tun, I thought the other smells like a mash tun, where it smells like a mash tun 3 days later kind of thing.
No.
No, it smells like the beautiful beginning of a beer to come.
Oh, that's the best smell of a whole brew day, that when you mash in, and yeah. Anyways, got off track there with my thoughts, but thank you very much, Luke. Great presentation, really enjoyed it. So I'm gonna hit the stop button, and you guys are free to talk about whatever you like.